What about commodities, Bob? Um, there have been a couple really stellar performers here in the past, I don't know, year or so. Copper had a nice run; it's backed off. Gold's doing pretty well. Um, we talked about gold, I know. What do you own any? Simply put.
Yeah, well, I think industrial commodities I think are really interesting um, from let's say a long cycle perspective because the challenge with industrial commodities, and you sort of made reference to this earlier, which is that like the production of copper today is a function of what decisions people made 10 to 15 years ago, right? And what the
Mhm.
demand was, the prospective demand was 10 or 15 years ago. And basically, there's nothing you could do about it. Like, on the margin, you can try and scrap and you can try and get more out of a mine or whatever, but like it takes 10 to 15 years to start a mine and produce. And
Mhm.
so we basically are seeing a circumstance where the production of the mine supply across a bunch of different, let's say on the
Mhm.
metals side of things, is um, is not projected to keep up with the demand now. uh, because the mine supply was done during was essentially set during a more depressed macroeconomic environment, and particularly as you start to look at many of the metals, next generation uh, you know activities are expected to use a fair amount of those metals, which is going to risk creating a squeeze. Now, will the squeeze be as bad as what sort of two lines on the chart predict? Probably not, because there's always efficiency, and then there's replacement, and whatever. People are pretty smart about how to make these things more and more efficient. But there's a
Mhm.
general idea that we're going to transition, let's say, to a increasingly green oriented world
Mhm.
without substantial use of industrial metals, which are undersupplied in the context of supply being set 10 or 15 years ago. Like, that story seems pretty compelling, and that story will likely flow through to other prices throughout the economy.
Right. And maybe with the caveat that, like, if this economic weakness that we talked about materializes, you know, that bet is temporarily off. Those
That's
right. I
right. That's
mean,
right.
the
Yeah,
prices get hurt.
of course, and there's. I mean, part of this is there's sort of a strategic portfolio point, and then there's tactical positioning, and of
Hmm.
course, in some ways, because metals are the most marginal demand element, and because the supply is generally fixed, they're actually some of the best captures of incremental demand, incremental global demand, I should say,
Hmm.
um, in a way that's a little different than oil, because traditionally oil was thought of as having a relatively fixed supply and demand being the primary driver. But what we've seen really in the last 10 years, since I guess the mid 2010s, is that supply actually is pretty price sensitive and responsive through the creation, of all the shale and related activities, which means that it's less oil is more supply sensitive than a lot of the metal side of markets these days.